Daniel Whitfield sat across from the 22nd woman in 6 weeks, and his hands were shaking under the table where nobody could see them. He pressed his palms flat against his knees and forced a smile, the same practiced smile he had used 21 times before. The woman across from him, a marketing manager named Isabel Cross, was still talking about her love of hiking, but Daniel had already stopped listening. Something about her laugh had reminded him of someone he was trying very hard to forget. He glanced at his watch. 14 minutes into the interview. That was longer than most. He would give her 6 more minutes, ask 2 more questions, and then he would end it the way he ended all of them, with a polite excuse and a promise to call that he had no intention of keeping. This was not how Daniel had imagined finding a wife. 3 years ago, if someone had told him he would be paying an agency to arrange structured meetings with strangers, scoring them like job applicants, he would have laughed. But 3 years ago, he had also been engaged to a woman named Charlotte Vane, and that had ended in a way he still could not fully explain to himself, let alone to anyone else. After Charlotte, Daniel built a wall. Not the kind of wall people talk about in therapy sessions, but a real, structural, load-bearing wall. He decided that love had been the problem. Emotion had been the problem. If he removed those variables and treated the search for a partner like any other decision in his life, a business acquisition, a hiring process, a contract negotiation, he could avoid the chaos that had nearly destroyed him. So he called Elena Vasquez. Elena ran a small, exclusive matchmaking agency out of a converted townhouse near the center of the city. She had a reputation for discretion and for taking on clients that other agencies found too demanding. When Daniel first walked into her office, sharp suit, tired eyes, a folder of very specific requirements tucked under his arm, she should have felt a small warning bell. She did not. She saw a successful, driven man who wanted help, and she saw a generous fee that would keep her small business running for another year. Daniel's list of requirements was long. He wanted someone intelligent but not overly opinionated, ambitious but flexible with her schedule, independent but willing to prioritize him. Elena read the list twice and told herself these were just the ordinary contradictions every client carried in their head, unaware of how they sounded out loud. The interviews began in early spring. Elena arranged them one at a time, at a quiet cafe with private booths, so that Daniel could meet each candidate without the pressure of a crowded restaurant. The first woman was named Claire Wynn, a school teacher with a gentle voice and a habit of asking thoughtful questions. Daniel rejected her after one meeting. His note to Elena said only that she seemed too soft. The second was Natalie Pierce, a lawyer who spoke quickly and confidently about her career. Daniel rejected her too. His note said she seemed too focused on her own opinions. Elena noticed the pattern almost immediately, but she told herself it was simply pickiness. Rich, successful men were often picky. It was, unfortunately, part of the job. By the 10th interview, a woman named Hannah Doyle, a nurse with a warm smile and an easy laugh, had come and gone without moving forward. Elena began keeping a private notebook, separate from the official client file, where she wrote down her own observations after each meeting. She noticed that Daniel rejected every woman who challenged him, even gently. He rejected every woman who asked him a personal question he did not want to answer. He kept, for longer than the others, only the women who agreed with him quickly and smiled at everything he said. None of them made it past a second meeting. At home, in his apartment on the 14th floor of a glass building overlooking the river, Daniel kept a private file on his laptop. It was a spreadsheet, color-coded, with columns for name, occupation, appearance, personality traits, and a final column labeled compatibility score. He updated it after every interview, sometimes before he had even left the cafe parking lot. He told himself this was simply being organized, thorough, the way he approached everything in his life that mattered. But there was another folder on his laptop, one he did not open often, and one that had nothing to do with Elena's agency. It was labeled with a single word, Charlotte. Inside were old photographs, messages he had never deleted, and a document he had started writing the week after she left and never finished. He told himself he kept it for closure. He did not examine that explanation too closely. Charlotte Vane had been the only woman Daniel ever asked to marry him. They met at a conference 4 years ago, and for the first year, everything had felt effortless in the way people describe when they talk about finding the right person. Charlotte was warm, curious, and unafraid to speak her mind, qualities that had drawn Daniel to her at first, and later became, in his private accounting of the relationship, the reasons everything fell apart. He did not like to think about the last few months before she left. He remembered arguments that seemed to come from nowhere, though if he was honest with himself, which he rarely allowed himself to be, they had come from somewhere very specific. He remembered accusing her of spending too much time with friends he did not approve of. He remembered checking her phone, once, twice, then regularly, and telling himself it was simply caution, not something darker. He remembered the night she packed a bag and left, and the words she said on her way out the door, words he had spent 3 years trying to forget and had never quite managed to. "You make me feel like I am disappearing," she had said, "and I do not know who I am anymore." Daniel told himself she had been overly sensitive, dramatic. He told himself this so many times that eventually he almost believed it. Now, sitting across from Isabel Cross, watching her laugh at her own joke about a hiking trip gone wrong, Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He thanked her for her time, told her he would be in touch, and left the cafe without finishing his coffee. In her office that evening, Elena reviewed her notes from the day. 22 interviews, 22 rejections. She had matched difficult clients before, clients with unrealistic expectations, clients who were simply too busy to commit to a relationship, but she had never seen a pattern quite like this one. She pulled out her private notebook and read back through her observations from the past 6 weeks. Every woman who agreed with him easily lasted longer. Every woman who asked a personal question was rejected within the hour. Every woman who mentioned her own career ambitions with confidence was rejected before the interview even ended. He watches their hands when they speak, not their faces. That last note gave Elena a small chill she could not immediately explain. She closed the notebook and told herself she was overthinking things. Clients had quirks. This was simply one of Daniel's. But that night, as she prepared the list of candidates for the following week, Elena found herself pausing over certain names, wondering, for reasons she could not fully articulate, whether she should include them at all. Meanwhile, across the city, a woman named Grace Bellamy sat at her kitchen table, staring at a text message from a friend who had recommended her for Elena's agency. Grace had been on Elena's list for 3 weeks, waiting for her turn. She did not know yet that she would be candidate number 14, or that her interview with Daniel would last only 9 minutes, the shortest of all of them, because she made the mistake, or the choice, depending on how one looked at it, of asking him directly why he had never married before. Daniel's answer that day was short and cold, and it ended the interview immediately. But it was not the answer itself that mattered. It was the flicker Elena noticed on the small security monitor in the back office, the one she used to review interviews for quality control. A flicker of something crossing Daniel's face for less than a second before he composed himself again. She would not understand what that flicker meant for many more weeks, but she would remember it. Daniel drove home that night, thinking about numbers. 22 women, 0 matches. His compatibility spreadsheet had grown to include detailed notes on physical appearance, tone of voice, how quickly each woman had complimented him, and how often they mentioned other men in their lives, friends, brothers, co-workers, anyone Daniel might have to compete with for attention. He did not see anything strange about this level of detail. He saw it as thoroughness, as control, as the only way he knew to protect himself from ever feeling the way he had felt the night Charlotte walked out the door. He did not know that in exactly 9 weeks, he would sit across from a woman named Sophia Marin, an architect with sharp eyes and a steady voice, and that she would ask him a single question that would unravel everything he had spent 3 years building. He did not know that Elena's private notebook would eventually become something much more important than a record of pickiness. He did not know that somewhere in the city, 2 women he had already rejected were beginning to talk to each other, comparing notes, describing feelings neither of them could quite explain during their brief meetings with him, an unease that lived somewhere beneath language. All Daniel knew, as he rode the elevator up to his apartment that night, was that the search would continue tomorrow. Candidate number 23 was already scheduled for the following Tuesday. Her name, according to the file Elena had sent over that afternoon, was Sophia Marin. He read her profile twice before falling asleep. Architect, 34 years old, no children, divorced once, 5 years ago. Elena had included a short note at the bottom of the file, unusual for her, something she rarely added to a candidate profile. Sophia asks a lot of questions, the note read. Some clients find this refreshing, others do not. Daniel closed his laptop and told himself he would be fine. He had handled 22 interviews without a single crack in his composure. There was no reason to think the 23rd would be any different. He was wrong, though he could not have known it yet, and neither could Elena, and neither could Sophia herself, who at that exact moment was sitting in her own apartment across town, reviewing the same file Elena had sent her, circling a strange detail in Daniel's public profile that did not match something a mutual acquaintance had once told her in passing, years earlier, at a dinner party neither of them had expected to attend. Sophia did not believe in coincidences. She believed in patterns, in the way buildings revealed their weaknesses long before they collapsed, in the small cracks that appeared months before anyone noticed the real damage underneath. Elena's agency occupied the ground floor of a narrow townhouse that had once been a piano shop, and the walls still carried a faint smell of old wood polish that no amount of renovation had ever fully removed. Elena had built the business from nothing, starting with a single desk and a borrowed laptop 9 years earlier, after leaving a corporate recruiting job that had paid well but left her feeling hollow by the end of every week. She liked to tell new clients that matchmaking and recruiting were not so different. Both required listening for what people did not say as much as what they did. But privately, she believed matchmaking demanded something recruiting never had, a kind of moral responsibility for the outcome. When a hire went badly, someone lost a job. When a match went badly, someone could lose far more than that. Her assistant, Nadia Okafor, had joined the agency 2 years earlier, fresh out of a psychology program and full of theories about attachment styles and communication patterns that Elena found useful more often than she expected to. It was Nadia who first suggested, gently, over coffee in the agency's small kitchen, that Elena's growing unease about Daniel Whitfield's file was worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing. "You keep saying he is just picky," Nadia said, stirring sugar into her cup slowly. "But picky clients reject people for being boring, or for not sharing enough interests, or for wanting different things out of life. He is rejecting them for showing personality. That is not pickiness. That is something else." Elena did not have an answer for her that day. She changed the subject, telling herself that Nadia, brilliant as she was, sometimes saw patterns that were not really there, a habit common among people freshly trained to look for them. But the conversation stayed with her longer than she expected, returning to her at odd moments, while she reviewed candidate files late at night, or watched the security monitor replay footage of interviews she was supposed to be evaluating only for compatibility. Daniel's professional life, meanwhile, continued exactly as it always had, unaffected by the quiet unraveling happening in a small office across town. He ran a mid-sized investment firm that managed portfolios for a handful of wealthy families, a business he had built with the same controlled, methodical energy he brought to everything else in his life. His employees respected him. Some feared him slightly, though none could have explained exactly why, since he had never raised his voice at any of them, never lost his temper in a meeting, never done anything that could be pointed to as evidence of a problem. He was simply, as one junior analyst once described him to a colleague over drinks, a man who made you feel like you were being graded even when nobody had asked you to perform. That controlled exterior extended to every part of Daniel's life outside the office as well. His apartment was minimal, almost sterile, decorated in shades of gray and white, with almost nothing personal on display. No photographs, no souvenirs from travel, nothing that revealed much about the man who lived there. Visitors, on the rare occasions he had any, often commented on how the space felt more like a hotel suite than a home. Daniel took this as a compliment, though it had not been intended as one. The only room in the apartment that broke this pattern was a small study near the back, where Daniel kept his laptop, his files, and the growing spreadsheet of candidates from Elena's agency. It was here, late at night after the interview with Isabel Cross, that he sat updating her entry, giving her a compatibility score of 62 out of 100, low enough to guarantee she would not receive a second call. He scrolled up through the spreadsheet, looking at the long list of names above hers. 21 other women, reduced to rows of data, numbers standing in for personalities he had barely allowed himself to notice. He did not see anything troubling in this. He saw efficiency. He saw a system working exactly as designed, filtering out anyone who did not fit the narrow shape of what he believed he needed. What Daniel did not see, because he had trained himself for 3 years not to see it, was the shape of that narrow requirement itself, and where it had really come from. 2 floors below his apartment building, in a small parking garage, Grace Bellamy sat in her car after finishing an evening shift at the hospital, where she worked as a physical therapist. She was not thinking about Daniel Whitfield that night, not really, though the memory of their 9-minute interview still surfaced sometimes when she least expected it, usually late at night, usually accompanied by a strange, unplaceable relief that the meeting had ended as quickly as it had. She had told a friend about it once, tried to explain the feeling, and found she did not have the right words. It was not that Daniel had said anything cruel. It was something underneath the words, something she could sense but not name, the way you can sometimes tell a bridge will not hold weight before it ever actually gives way. She had mentioned this feeling, almost as an afterthought, to Elena during a brief follow-up call the agency made to every candidate after their interview, a standard courtesy meant to gather feedback for future matches. Elena had written the comment down in her private notebook that same night, next to 2 similar comments from other rejected candidates, though at the time she still was not sure what, if anything, the pattern meant. By the time Sophia Marin's interview arrived on the calendar, Elena's notebook held 11 separate entries describing the same vague unease, 11 women who could not quite explain what had unsettled them, only that something had. Elena had never seen anything like it in 9 years of running the agency, and though she told herself repeatedly that she was likely imagining a connection that was not really there, some instinct, the same instinct that had built her business from a single borrowed desk, told her otherwise. She almost canceled Sophia's interview that week. She almost called Daniel and told him the search was over, that she could not in good conscience continue arranging meetings for him. But she had no real evidence, nothing she could point to and call proof, only a collection of feelings from women who could not explain themselves, and a flicker on a security monitor that had lasted less than a second. So she let the interview proceed, telling herself she would watch more closely this time than she ever had before. She circled the name Charlotte Vane in her notes, a name she had heard once before, in a very different context, and wondered if Tuesday's interview was going to be as simple as everyone expected it to be. It was not. Sophia Marin arrived at the cafe 11 minutes early, which was unusual for her, and she used the extra time to study the room rather than her phone. She noticed the exits, the placement of the private booths, the way the lighting had been arranged to make every table feel more intimate than the last. She noticed, too, the small camera mounted discreetly near the ceiling above the booth Elena's agency always used, a detail most candidates never bothered to look for. Sophia had spent her career studying structures, the way buildings stood or failed, and she carried that same attention into every part of her life, including a blind date arranged by a matchmaking service she had joined mostly at the urging of a cousin, who worried she spent too much time alone with her blueprints and not enough time with people. She had gone through the agency's process with mild curiosity rather than real hope, filling out questionnaires, answering Elena's careful interview questions during intake, and reading through the profile Elena eventually sent her for a man named Daniel Whitfield. The profile had described him as successful, driven, and looking for a serious long-term relationship. Ordinary enough, but something about the name had tugged at a memory Sophia could not immediately place, a feeling like walking past a building she had visited once, years ago, and could no longer quite recall from the inside. It came to her 2 nights before the interview, while she was reviewing structural drawings for a renovation project. She had been at a dinner party, perhaps 4 years earlier, seated next to a woman named Charlotte, whose last name Sophia could not fully remember, though she remembered the conversation clearly, because it had stayed with her for reasons she could not, at the time, explain. Charlotte had been quiet for most of the evening, and when Sophia asked her gently if everything was all right, Charlotte had said something Sophia never forgot. "I used to know exactly who I was," Charlotte had said, staring into her wine glass. "Then I was with someone for 2 years, and by the end I could not remember. He never hit me," she added quickly, as though anticipating the question. "He never did anything anyone could point to. He just made me smaller and smaller, until there was nothing left to see." Sophia had not thought about that conversation in years, but when Elena's file arrived with the name Daniel Whitfield printed at the top, and a short biography mentioning a broken engagement several years prior, the memory surfaced whole, uninvited, and would not leave her alone. She told herself it was probably nothing. Charlotte was a common enough name, and the man Charlotte had described that night had never been named at all. Sophia had no real evidence connecting the two, but she decided, sitting in her apartment with the file open on her screen, that she would attend the interview anyway, not because she expected romance, but because she wanted to understand whether her instinct was worth trusting. When Daniel walked into the cafe, exactly on time, dressed in a dark blazer that fit him with the precision of someone who paid attention to such things, Sophia watched him for a moment before he noticed her. She watched the way he scanned the room first, the way his eyes moved briefly to the camera near the ceiling before settling on her table, the way his expression rearranged itself into something practiced and pleasant before he crossed the room to sit down. "Good afternoon," he said, extending a hand. "You must be Sophia." She shook his hand and noted, without meaning to, that his grip was firm but brief, careful, as though calibrated to convey confidence without inviting closeness. For the first several minutes, the conversation moved the way these conversations usually did. Daniel asked about her work, and she described a few current projects, a renovation of an old theater downtown, a residential complex near the river. He listened attentively, nodding at appropriate moments, asking follow-up questions that showed he had, at minimum, been paying attention. Sophia noted this. Most of the men Elena had matched her with over the past year had barely managed that much. But she also noticed what Daniel did not ask. He did not ask why she had become an architect, what drew her to the work beyond the practical details. He did not ask about her family, her friends, the people who filled the rest of her life outside her career. His questions stayed carefully on the surface, gathering facts without ever reaching for meaning, and Sophia recognized the pattern because she used a version of it herself sometimes, when she was evaluating a client she did not yet trust, keeping the conversation controlled until she understood what she was dealing with. 20 minutes in, she decided to test something. "You mentioned you were engaged once," she said, choosing her words carefully. "What happened, if you do not mind me asking?" It was a fair question, the kind any reasonable person might ask on a date meant to determine long-term compatibility, and Sophia watched closely for the reaction. Daniel's expression did not change dramatically. There was no obvious flinch, no visible anger. But something in his posture shifted, a slight straightening, the kind of adjustment a person makes when preparing to defend a position, rather than simply answer a question. "It did not work out," he said. "She was not ready for the kind of commitment I needed. People grow apart sometimes." It was a smooth answer, rehearsed in the way people rehearse explanations they have given many times before, to friends, to family, perhaps to themselves in the mirror during quiet moments they would never admit to anyone. Sophia let it sit for a moment, before pressing gently. "That sounds difficult," she said. "Do you two still talk?" "No," Daniel said, a fraction too quickly. "That chapter is closed." Sophia nodded and let the subject drop, though she filed the answer away carefully, the way she might note a hairline crack in a foundation wall. Not yet dangerous, but worth watching. She shifted the conversation to lighter topics after that, and Daniel visibly relaxed, his answers becoming looser, more animated, as he talked about a recent business trip and a restaurant he had discovered in another city. Sophia let him talk, asking occasional questions, watching more than speaking. And she began to understand something about Daniel Whitfield that she suspected Elena's other candidates had never fully articulated, even to themselves. He was comfortable, even charming, as long as the conversation stayed under his control. The moment a question reached beneath the surface, something closed, quickly and completely, like a door swinging shut on a hinge that had been oiled many times before. Near the end of the interview, Sophia asked one more question, this one deliberately simple, almost casual. "What are you actually looking for?" she asked. "Not the version you tell the matchmaker, the real version." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. Sophia watched his eyes move, not toward her, but somewhere past her shoulder, toward a middle distance that seemed to hold something private he had not intended to reveal. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier polish. "I want someone who will not leave," he said quietly. "That is all. Someone who understands that people are not disposable, that you do not just walk away when things get difficult." It was, Sophia thought later, the most honest thing he said during the entire interview, and also the most unsettling, though she could not have explained precisely why in the moment. There was something underneath the words that felt less like a wish for loyalty and more like a demand for permanence, regardless of what that permanence might cost the person expected to provide it. Sophia said nothing for a moment, letting the words settle between them. In her line of work, she had learned that people revealed their true intentions not through grand declarations, but through small, unguarded slips, a beam placed slightly off-center, a support column that did not quite match the drawings. Daniel's answer had been exactly that kind of slip, and she filed it away with the same careful attention she would give to a hairline fracture discovered during an inspection, not yet dangerous, but the kind of detail that told you everything about what might happen under enough pressure. She steered the conversation back to safer ground after that, asking about his favorite way to spend a weekend, and Daniel answered readily, describing long runs along the river and quiet mornings with coffee and the news, his composure fully restored, as though the earlier moment had never happened at all. Sophia matched his tone, nodding, smiling where it seemed expected, giving no outward sign that anything unusual had occurred. It was a skill she had cultivated over years of client meetings, where powerful, difficult men expected agreement and grew defensive without it, and she used it now, not out of genuine warmth, but out of a careful, deliberate curiosity, to see how far the conversation might go, before Daniel noticed she was studying him, rather than simply enjoying his company. The interview ended shortly after, with Daniel thanking her for her time and saying he would be in touch. Sophia walked out of the cafe into the cool afternoon air and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, replaying the conversation in her mind, particularly that final answer, the flicker of something raw beneath his careful surface. She thought again of Charlotte, of the dinner party years ago, of the words that had stayed with her ever since. He never did anything anyone could point to. He just made me smaller and smaller. Sophia did not believe in coincidences, but she also knew better than to build a conclusion on a foundation this thin. She needed more information before she trusted her instinct completely. That evening, she called Elena's office, not to reject the match outright, but to ask a question she suspected Elena had never been asked by a candidate before. "Can you tell me the name of his former fiancée?" she asked. "I think I might know her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, longer than Sophia expected, and when Elena finally answered, her voice carried a note of caution that told Sophia her instinct had not been misplaced after all. "Why do you ask?" Elena said carefully. Sophia explained the dinner party, the conversation she remembered, the unsettling feeling that had followed her out of the cafe that afternoon. Elena listened without interrupting, and when Sophia finished, there was another long silence before Elena spoke again. "I need to tell you something," Elena said finally, "but not over the phone. Can you come by the office tomorrow morning?" Sophia agreed, and after hanging up, she sat by her window for a long time, looking out at the darkening skyline, thinking about buildings that looked solid from the outside and hollow underneath, and about a man who had told her, without quite meaning to, exactly what he was afraid of. Across the city, Daniel sat in his study, opening his spreadsheet to add Sophia's entry. He typed her name, her occupation, and began scoring her against his usual categories. But when he reached the final column, compatibility score, his fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than they had for any of the previous 22 candidates. He closed the laptop without finishing the entry, an action so unlike him that he sat afterward in the quiet study, unsure exactly why he had done it, only that something about the interview had left a mark he could not immediately name, a small crack in the careful architecture he had spent 3 years building around himself. Before Sophia, there had been Priya Nandan, candidate number 20, a therapist with a calm, steady presence that had unsettled Daniel more than any of the loud, confident women who came before her. Priya had not asked him blunt questions the way Sophia later would. Instead, she had simply listened, nodding at the right moments, letting silences stretch a little longer than was comfortable. A technique Daniel did not recognize as a technique at all, only as a strange kind of pressure building steadily across the table. Near the end of their meeting, Priya had asked him a single question, delivered so gently that it took Daniel a moment to register its weight. "Do you think you are doing this search because you want a partner?" she asked. or because you want to prove something to someone who is no longer in the room? Daniel had laughed the question off at the time, calling it an odd thing for a first date, and Priya had smiled and let the subject drop, sensing correctly that pushing further would end the interview immediately. But she had gone home that evening and, unprompted, sent Elena a short message, the kind Elena did not usually receive from candidates who had not been chosen for a second meeting. "I do not think this man is ready for what he says he wants," Priya had written. "I say this as a professional, not because I am upset about the outcome. Something under the surface concerns me." Elena had read the message twice, saved it, and told herself she would think about it later, the way she told herself many things during those weeks that she never quite got around to examining closely enough. It joined the growing collection of small warnings in her private notebook, sitting alongside Grace Bellamy's unease and the strange flicker on the security monitor, each one insufficient on its own, each one a little harder to dismiss when placed beside the others. Nadia, meanwhile, had begun a small project of her own, one she had not yet mentioned to Elena. Curious about the pattern of rejected candidates and their remarkably similar, if vague, descriptions of unease, she started keeping a simple spreadsheet, far less detailed than Daniel's, but built with a very different purpose. She logged the length of each interview, the stated reason for rejection, and any comment the candidate made afterward during the agency's standard follow-up call. By the time Sophia's interview was scheduled, Nadia's spreadsheet showed a pattern so consistent that she printed it out and left it on Elena's desk with a note attached. "I think we need to talk about Daniel Whitfield before we send anyone else," the note read. Elena found the printout the morning after her phone call with Sophia, and the two pieces of evidence arriving so close together, Sophia's memory of a dinner party years earlier, and Nadia's careful documentation of a pattern neither of them had wanted to fully name, settled something in Elena that had been circling for weeks without quite landing. She sat at her desk for a long time that morning, the printout in one hand, her phone in the other, thinking about the promise she made to every client who walked through her door. A promise not just to find them a match, but to protect the people on both sides of every introduction she arranged. She thought about the 22 women who had sat across from Daniel Whitfield over the past 6 weeks, most of whom would never know why their interviews had ended so quickly, and about the 23rd, who was scheduled to arrive at her office within the hour, carrying a memory that might finally explain what all of them had been sensing without being able to say. Elena picked up her phone and called Nadia into her office. "We need to look at this properly," she said, "before Sophia gets here. All of it. Every note, every comment, everything we have been too polite to say out loud." Nadia nodded and closed the door behind her, and for the next hour, the two women went through the file together, piece by piece, building a picture neither of them wanted to see clearly, but both now understood they could no longer avoid. He told himself he would finish the entry tomorrow. He did not know yet that tomorrow, Elena and Sophia would be sitting across from each other, in the agency's small office, comparing notes that would change the course of everything that followed. Elena's office felt smaller than usual the next morning, though nothing about the room had changed. Sophia sat across from her in the same chair every candidate used during intake, but this time there was no questionnaire between them, no folder of profiles, only 2 cups of coffee going cold, and a silence that stretched longer than either woman seemed willing to break first. "Tell me about the dinner party," Elena said finally. Sophia recounted it carefully, the way she recounted structural assessments to nervous clients, laying out facts in order, resisting the urge to fill gaps with speculation. She described the woman named Charlotte, the quiet sadness in her voice, the specific words that had stayed lodged in Sophia's memory for 4 years, despite the two of them never speaking again after that single evening. "He never did anything anyone could point to. He just made me smaller and smaller until there was nothing left to see." Elena listened without interrupting, her expression carefully neutral, though Sophia noticed her fingers tightening slightly around her coffee cup as the story unfolded. When Sophia finished, Elena sat back and exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a person takes when a suspicion they had been quietly nursing finally receives its first real piece of confirmation. "His former fiancée's name is Charlotte Vane," Elena said. "I do not know if it is the same woman, but I think we should find out." She turned her laptop toward Sophia and opened the private notebook file she had been keeping for weeks, the one that lived outside the official client records, the one Nadia had helped her organize, into something resembling evidence rather than scattered impressions. Sophia read through it slowly, her architect's eye picking out the pattern immediately, the way it might catch a repeated flaw across a dozen different blueprints. 11 women, Sophia said quietly. 11 separate reports of the same feeling, and none of them able to say exactly why. That is not unusual on its own, Elena admitted. Plenty of dates end badly, for reasons neither person can fully explain. But 11, all describing something so similar, all pointing toward the same man. I have never seen anything like it in 9 years of doing this work. Nadia knocked once, and let herself in, without waiting for an answer, carrying a folder of her own. She had spent the previous evening doing something neither Elena nor Sophia had yet considered, searching public records for any information about Charlotte Vane that might exist beyond the private world of Daniel's rejected file folder. I found her, Nadia said, setting the folder on the desk. She works at a design studio 2 districts over. I did not reach out. I thought that should not happen without everyone agreeing to it first. Sophia opened the folder and found a printed photograph. A professional headshot pulled from the design studio's website, alongside a short biography. The moment she saw the face, something settled in her chest, a certainty, replacing the uncertainty, that had followed her since the interview the day before. That is her, Sophia said. That is the woman from the dinner party. The 3 women sat with that confirmation for a long moment, none of them quite sure what to do with it. Elena had built her business on trust, on the careful, responsible matching of 2 people who deserved a fair chance at happiness, and the idea that she had spent 6 weeks unknowingly sending 22 women into meetings with a man whose past held something troubling enough to leave lasting marks, felt like a betrayal of everything her work was supposed to stand for. We cannot just accuse him of something we cannot prove, Elena said slowly, thinking out loud. If Charlotte left him for reasons that have nothing to do with any of this, we could be doing real harm to his reputation over a misunderstanding. Sophia nodded, though her expression made clear she did not think that outcome was especially likely. I am not suggesting we accuse him of anything, she said. I am suggesting we find out the truth before another woman sits across from him without knowing what she might be walking into. Nadia, who had been quiet since delivering the folder, spoke up then, her voice careful but firm. There might be a way to do both, she said. Sophia already has a second interview scheduled with him for next week, assuming he requests one, which given his reaction yesterday, seems likely. What if she went, not to find a husband, but to understand him properly, carefully, with all of us watching this time, not just the automated camera? The suggestion hung in the room for a moment, and Sophia felt the same instinct she experienced when walking into a building with a suspected structural problem, a mixture of caution and clear-eyed determination that had served her well throughout her career. She was not naive about what Nadia was suggesting. It carried real risk, both practical and emotional, and she would need to think carefully about how far she was willing to go before agreeing to anything. I need to know more about Charlotte first, Sophia said finally. Not to expose her or drag her into this without her consent, but because if there is a pattern here, she deserves to know that someone finally noticed it, and we deserve to understand what actually happened before either of us decides what to do next. Elena agreed, though reluctantly, aware that reaching out to Charlotte carried its own risks, the possibility of reopening old wounds for a woman who may have spent years trying to move past whatever had happened between her and Daniel. But she also understood, sitting in her office that morning, with the weight of 11 unexplained reports pressing on her conscience, that continuing to send candidates into Daniel's interviews without answering these questions was no longer something she could justify to herself. She drafted a careful message to Charlotte that afternoon, explaining who she was, why she was reaching out, and offering Charlotte the choice to respond or not, with no pressure either way. She sent it that evening, and then, for the first time in the 9 years she had run her agency, Elena found herself unable to focus on any of her other client files, checking her phone every few minutes, waiting for a response that might not come at all. It came just after midnight, 3 words long, followed by a longer message that arrived 4 minutes later, once Charlotte had apparently gathered her thoughts. I remember you, the first message read, addressed not to Elena, but somehow already anticipating exactly why she had been contacted. The longer message that followed described, in careful, measured language, a relationship that had started with warmth and slowly narrowed into something Charlotte described as a kind of quiet erosion, so gradual she had not recognized it happening until she was already standing outside it, looking back at who she used to be before she met Daniel Whitfield. He never raised his voice, Charlotte wrote. He never did anything anyone would call abuse if you listed it item by item, but I stopped seeing my friends because he made every visit feel like a small betrayal. I stopped talking about my ambitions because every time I did, he found a way to make them feel smaller than his own. By the end, I did not recognize the person I had become, and it took me over a year after leaving to start feeling like myself again. Elena read the message 3 times before setting her phone down, her hands unsteady in a way that surprised her. She had spent 9 years building relationships between strangers, trusting that most people who came through her door, however imperfect, were searching in good faith for connection. She had never imagined she might one day sit with evidence, suggesting one of her clients had spent years slowly dismantling another person's sense of self, so carefully that neither Charlotte nor Elena had been able to name it until now. She forwarded the message to Sophia the next morning, with Charlotte's permission, and the two of them met again in Elena's office that afternoon, joined this time by Nadia, all 3 women now facing a decision none of them had expected to make when the week began. "Do we tell him we know?" Nadia asked. "Do we simply refuse further meetings and move on? Or do we do what Sophia suggested and go into the next interview with our eyes open, hoping to understand enough to help the women who might come after her if we do nothing?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment, thinking not of buildings this time, but of the dinner party 4 years earlier, of Charlotte's quiet, careful voice, describing something she had not yet learned to name. She thought of the 11 women in Elena's notebook, of Grace Bellamy's 9-minute interview, of Priya's gentle, professional warning that Daniel was not ready for what he claimed to want. "I will go to the second interview," Sophia said finally, but not as a candidate looking for a husband, as someone trying to understand what actually happened here, and whether there is a way to reach him before this pattern repeats itself with someone who has no one like us watching closely enough to notice. Elena did not respond immediately. She was thinking about liability, about the ethics of her own business, about whether continuing this arrangement crossed a line she had never expected to approach in 9 years of careful, responsible matchmaking. But she was also thinking about the 22 women who had already passed through Daniel's interviews without anyone asking the right questions, and about the possibility, however uncertain, that Sophia might be the only person positioned to finally understand what was happening beneath his carefully controlled surface. "All right," Elena said finally. "But we do this carefully, and the moment it feels unsafe, for any reason, you walk away, and we handle whatever comes next, together." While the 3 women sat with their decision, Daniel was 3 miles away, standing in his mother's kitchen for the first time in nearly 2 months, having agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to a Sunday visit he usually found ways to avoid. Margaret Whitfield had raised Daniel alone after his father left when Daniel was 9 years old, and she had done so with a fierce, controlling love that Daniel had spent most of his adult life describing as simply strict, never examining the word more closely than that. "You look tired," Margaret said, setting a plate in front of him, without asking if he wanted it. "Is the search still going badly?" Daniel picked at the food rather than answering directly, and Margaret, who had never been comfortable with silence, filled it herself, the way she always had. "You know," she said, "you take after your father in some ways, though I never liked telling you that. He was charming right up until the moment he was not. People thought the world of him until they got close enough to see how little he actually gave them." Daniel set down his fork, an old irritation rising in his chest, familiar and unwelcome. "We are not talking about Dad," he said. "We are always talking about your father," Margaret said, not unkindly, though the words landed with more weight than she perhaps intended. "Everything you do is built around not becoming him, and somewhere along the way you decided the only way to manage that was to control every single variable so tightly that nothing could ever surprise you the way he surprised me." Daniel did not answer. He had heard versions of this conversation before, usually late at night, usually after his mother had a second glass of wine, and grew looser with the truths she normally kept carefully folded away. He did not like these conversations, not because he thought his mother was wrong, exactly, but because some quiet part of him suspected she was more right than he wanted to admit, and admitting it would require examining things about himself he had spent years successfully avoiding. Charlotte used to say something similar, Margaret added, watching her son's face carefully. That you held on too tightly. That you made her feel like she was always one mistake away from being left, the way your father left us. Please do not bring up Charlotte, Daniel said, his voice tighter now, the practiced calm from his interviews entirely absent in this kitchen, where no camera watched, and no stranger sat across from him waiting to be impressed. Margaret studied her son for a long moment, and something softened slightly in her expression, though her next words carried no less weight for the gentler delivery. I only bring her up because I worry, she said. You are searching for someone who will never leave, and I understand why, better than you think I do. But Daniel, nobody stays because they are trapped. People stay because they choose to, every day, freely. If you keep trying to build a cage instead of a home, you will keep ending up alone, no matter how many women that agency sends your way. Daniel left shortly after, the visit ending earlier than either of them had planned, and he drove home in silence, his mother's words circling in his mind, despite every effort to dismiss them. He told himself she did not understand modern relationships, that she was projecting her own bitterness about his father onto a situation that had nothing to do with either of them. But some quieter, more honest part of him, the same part that had gone silent for a long moment during his interview with Sophia the day before, recognized something in his mother's words that he was not yet ready to examine. That night, back in his study, he finally finished entering Sophia's data into his spreadsheet. He gave her a compatibility score of 87, the highest he had recorded for any candidate, and beneath the score, in a notes field he almost never used, he typed a short sentence he deleted twice before finally letting it remain. She sees more than she says. This might be a problem, or it might be exactly what I need. He requested a second interview through Elena's office the following morning, unaware that the agency had already begun preparing for it in ways he could not have anticipated. Unaware that his mother's careful, worried words had planted a seed that would not fully take root for several more weeks, and unaware that the woman he was about to meet again carried with her not just her own instincts, but the testimony of a woman he had spent 3 years trying very hard to forget. Sophia nodded, and outside the office window, the afternoon light shifted slowly across the rooftops of the city, indifferent to the quiet decision being made in the small room below. A decision that would, within 2 weeks, bring Sophia and Daniel back to the same table, this time with far more at stake than either of them had understood during their first meeting. The second interview was scheduled for a Thursday evening, at a small restaurant Daniel chose himself, a departure from Elena's usual cafe arrangement that Elena allowed only after installing, with Sophia's knowledge and consent, a small recording device inside Sophia's handbag, a precaution none of them had ever needed before this particular case. Sophia arrived first this time, and she used the extra minutes to steady herself, aware that tonight required a different kind of attention than the first meeting had. She was no longer simply evaluating a potential match. She was trying to understand a pattern that had already left visible marks on at least one woman, possibly many more, and she needed to hold 2 very different tasks in her mind at once, appearing natural and engaged, while remaining carefully observant beneath the surface. Daniel arrived 7 minutes later, apologizing for a work call that had run long, and Sophia noticed immediately that something about him seemed different from their first meeting. A looseness in his shoulders, an eagerness in his expression that had not been present before. He ordered wine for both of them without asking her preference, a small detail Sophia filed away without comment, and began the conversation by complimenting her appearance in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. You seem happy tonight, Sophia said, watching him carefully. I am, Daniel said, and for a moment his guard seemed to drop slightly. I do not usually request second interviews. Elena will tell you that. Something about our conversation last week stayed with me. Sophia smiled and let him continue, guiding the conversation gently toward the territory she needed to explore without making her intentions obvious. She asked about his work, listened patiently to a long story about a difficult client, and waited for an opening that would let her return, carefully, to the subject of his past. The opening came almost an hour into dinner, when Daniel, more relaxed now after a second glass of wine, mentioned offhand that he had visited his mother the previous Sunday. "How is your relationship with your mother?" Sophia asked, keeping her tone light, curious rather than probing. "Complicated," Daniel said, and something in his voice shifted, a rawness Sophia had not heard during their first meeting. "She raised me alone after my father left. She is not always easy to be around, but she means well." "That must have been difficult growing up," Sophia said, "losing a parent that young." Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass slowly on the table. "He did not really leave us in the dramatic sense," he said finally. "He just slowly stopped showing up, missed dinners, missed birthdays, and then one day he was simply gone, living across the country with a new family, as though we had been something he outgrew, rather than people he had actually loved." Sophia felt something shift in her understanding of the man across from her. Not sympathy exactly, though there was some of that too, but a clearer sense of the architecture underneath his careful exterior, the load-bearing beam that everything else in his personality had been built around. She thought of her own work, of buildings designed around a single structural flaw that engineers spent years compensating for, without ever addressing the flaw itself, adding supports and reinforcements that made the building stand but never made it whole. "Do you think that experience shaped how you approach relationships now?" she asked, careful to keep the question gentle rather than clinical. Daniel's expression closed slightly, the openness from a moment earlier retreating behind something more guarded. "Everyone's past shapes them," he said. "I do not see why that would be unusual." Sophia recognized the shift immediately and did not push further, aware that pressing too hard too quickly would end the conversation the way it had ended so many others before her. Instead, she redirected gently, asking about happier memories from his childhood, and watched Daniel visibly relax again as the subject moved to safer ground. But she had what she needed, or at least the beginning of it. A father who disappeared slowly, rather than dramatically, leaving a wound that never fully closed. A mother who, based on Daniel's careful phrasing, had likely raised him with more control than warmth, perhaps out of her own fear of losing him the way she had lost his father. A man who had grown into adulthood, equating love with permanence, and permanence with control, unable to distinguish between someone choosing to stay and someone being unable to leave. Near the end of dinner, Daniel asked Sophia a question that surprised her with its directness, a departure from his usual careful, controlled conversation. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked. "Or are we all just running the same patterns over and over, telling ourselves each time that this time will be different?" Sophia considered the question seriously before answering, aware that her response mattered more than Daniel likely realized. "I think people can change," she said finally, "but only if they are willing to look honestly at the pattern first. Most people spend their whole lives managing the symptoms instead of examining the cause. It is like reinforcing a cracked foundation instead of finding out why it cracked in the first place. The building might stand for years, but the crack never actually heals unless someone addresses what caused it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Sophia watched something move behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed, but not quite fast enough to hide entirely. She wondered, not for the first time that evening, whether some part of Daniel already knew exactly what she was describing, whether he had spent years sensing the crack in his own foundation without ever finding the courage, or perhaps the support, to examine it honestly. "That is a very architectural way of thinking about relationships," Daniel said finally, his tone lighter than his expression suggested he felt. "It is the only way I know how to think about anything," Sophia said, matching his lighter tone while holding, underneath it, the full weight of what she had just witnessed. They said goodnight shortly after, Daniel walking her to her car, thanking her again for the evening, expressing hope for a third meeting soon. Sophia agreed, though she felt none of the simple excitement a real second date might have produced, only a complicated mixture of sympathy and concern that she would need time to properly untangle. She called Elena from her car before driving home, describing the evening in careful detail, the story about his father, the question about whether people could really change, the flicker of recognition that had crossed his face and then quickly disappeared. "I do not think he is a monster," Sophia said. "I think he is a deeply wounded person who has never once been asked to look honestly at his own wound, and who has instead spent years building an elaborate system to manage it from a distance. That does not excuse what happened with Charlotte. or with whoever else this might have happened to before her, but it might explain it. Elena listened carefully, saving every detail for the notebook she still kept, though it had grown into something far more substantial now than a simple record of client complaints. Understanding him does not mean we stop being careful, she said finally. Whatever is underneath this, it has already hurt people. That matters more than his reasons, even if his reasons help us understand what needs to happen next. Sophia agreed, though she found herself thinking, on the drive home that night, about her own broken marriage 5 years earlier, about patterns she had spent considerable time and effort examining honestly in the years since, and about how rare it truly was for anyone to be given the opportunity, or perhaps the courage, to look directly at the crack running through the center of who they were. She did not yet know that within days, 2 more women from Daniel's rejected candidate list would come forward independently, with stories eerily similar to Charlotte's, each one small and individually explainable, but together, forming a pattern too consistent to ignore. The first of the 2 women to come forward was Natalie Pierce, the lawyer Daniel had rejected early in the process for seeming, in his own words, too focused on her own opinions. She called Elena's office on a Tuesday morning, explaining that a friend had mentioned, in vague terms, that Elena was looking into some concerns about a former client, and that she wanted to share something she had not thought worth mentioning after her own brief interview months earlier. "He asked me almost nothing about myself," Natalie said, once Elena had her on speakerphone with Nadia listening quietly nearby. "But he asked, twice, in different ways, whether I had ever left a job or a relationship without giving the other person a chance to fix things first. At the time, I thought it was a strange but harmless question. Now that I think back on it, it felt less like curiosity and more like he was testing whether I was the kind of person who leaves." Elena thanked her carefully, noting the account in her growing file, and had barely ended the call before her phone rang again, this time with a number she recognized as belonging to Claire Wynne, the gentle schoolteacher who had been the very first candidate in the entire process, rejected after a single meeting for seeming, in Daniel's early notes, too soft. "I almost did not call," Claire admitted. "It has been weeks, and I told myself I was imagining things. But he said something toward the end of our interview that has stayed with me. And after what my friend mentioned about your call to Natalie, I thought you should know. He told me that most people give up on relationships too easily, that real commitment meant staying, even when it was hard, even when you were unhappy. I remember thinking it sounded less like a philosophy about love and more like a rule he was building for someone else to follow. Someone who was not me, someone from before." Elena ended both calls within the same hour and sat afterward at her desk with Nadia across from her, the 2 of them silent for a long moment as the weight of what they now understood settled fully between them. 11 vague reports of unease had grown into something far more concrete, 3 separate accounts, spanning the earliest interviews to the most recent, all describing the same underlying pattern: a man who tested potential partners for their willingness to endure difficulty rather than seeking genuine compatibility, a man who seemed to be searching not for love, but for a guarantee against ever being left again. "We cannot keep sending him candidates," Nadia said finally, breaking the silence. "Whatever compassion Sophia has found for him, whatever complicated history is driving this, it does not change what continuing to do so would mean for the next woman who walks into that cafe." Elena agreed, though she understood the decision would carry real consequences for her business. Daniel was a paying client with a contract, and ending the arrangement without clear, provable justification opened her agency to real professional risk. But she also understood, more clearly than she had allowed herself to admit over the previous 6 weeks, that continuing the arrangement carried a different kind of risk entirely, one measured not in dollars, but in the well-being of women who trusted her agency to look out for them. She drafted a letter that afternoon, formal and carefully worded, informing Daniel that the agency would be pausing his search, pending a conversation about the concerns that had been raised. She did not send it immediately. Some instinct told her to wait, to see what came of Sophia's continued contact with him first, aware that an abrupt cutoff might close a door that was, however slowly, beginning to open on its own. Across the city, in his dim study, Daniel sat with his laptop open, and Sophia's entry deleted from the spreadsheet, an empty row where 23 lines of careful, clinical data had once lived. He told himself the deletion meant nothing, that he had simply decided she was not, after all, the right fit, that he would move on to the next candidate the way he had moved on 22 times before. But he did not open a new entry. He did not request another interview. Instead, he sat in the quiet room, the only light coming from his screen, and found himself thinking, against every instinct that had protected him for 3 years, about his father's slow disappearance, about his mother's careful, controlling love, about Charlotte's face on the night she left, and about a woman named Sophia who had looked at him across a dinner table and described, without knowing the details of his own life, exactly the shape of the wound he had spent so long trying to hide, even from himself. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, feeling something he had successfully avoided feeling for 3 full years finally beginning to surface, unsure yet whether he had the courage to let it rise all the way to the top, or whether, like so many times before, he would find a way to push it back down before it could change anything at all. 3 days passed without word from Daniel, an unusual silence, given how quickly he had requested the second interview after the first. Elena kept the unsent letter in her drafts folder, checking it periodically, as though rereading it might reveal whether the decision it represented was the right one. Sophia, for her part, found herself thinking about the dinner more than she expected to, not with romantic longing, but with a persistent, nagging curiosity about what Daniel might do with the discomfort she had watched settle over him near the end of their evening together. On the 4th day, Daniel called Elena's office directly, something he had never done before, always preferring to communicate through the structured booking system the agency normally used. Nadia answered, and recognizing his voice, transferred the call immediately to Elena's office, signaling silently for her to put it on speaker. "I need to ask you something," Daniel said, his voice lacking its usual composed certainty. "And I need you to be honest with me, even if the answer is uncomfortable." Elena exchanged a glance with Nadia before answering carefully. "Go ahead," she said. "Has anyone said anything about me?" Daniel asked. "To you. Something concerning. I have this feeling, and I cannot entirely explain where it is coming from, but something about my last conversation with Sophia has been sitting wrong with me for days, and I keep wondering if she knows something I do not think I have ever told anyone at this agency." Elena hesitated, weighing the professional risk of honesty against the growing certainty that honesty was, at this point, the only responsible path forward. She thought of Charlotte's message, of Natalie and Claire's careful, hesitant accounts, of the 11 vague reports sitting in her private notebook, and she made a decision that would have been unthinkable to her 6 weeks earlier. "Yes," she said. "Several things, actually. I think it would be better if we discuss this in person, Daniel. Would you be willing to come to the office tomorrow?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Elena wondered if the call had dropped. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice had changed entirely, stripped of the careful control that usually shaped every word he said. "Is this about Charlotte?" he asked quietly. Elena did not answer immediately, and the silence itself became its own kind of answer. Daniel exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, a sound that carried more exhaustion than surprise, as though some part of him had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time without ever admitting it consciously. "I will come tomorrow," he said finally. 10 o'clock. Please do not bring anyone else into it who does not already know. I do not think I can handle an audience for this." Elena agreed, and after ending the call, sat quietly with Nadia for several minutes, both women aware that whatever happened the next morning would determine not just the future of Daniel's search, but potentially the reputation and direction of the agency itself. Sophia arrived at the office early the next day, having been invited by Elena the previous evening, under the reasoning that Sophia's involvement in uncovering the pattern gave her a right to be present, if she wanted it, though Elena made clear the choice was entirely hers. Sophia agreed to attend, though she spent the drive over turning the decision over carefully in her mind, uncertain whether her presence would help Daniel finally confront what he had been avoiding, or whether it would simply make him retreat further behind his careful walls. Daniel arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, dressed less formally than usual, his composure visibly thinner than it had been during either of his interviews with Sophia. He stopped short in the doorway of Elena's office upon seeing Sophia seated near the window, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, before he composed himself enough to take the seat Elena offered him. "I did not expect you to be here," he said to Sophia, his tone carrying no obvious accusation, only a kind of tired resignation. "I asked to be," Sophia said honestly. "I think you deserve to hear this from people who are not trying to hurt you, even though what we have to say will not be easy." Elena began carefully, laying out the pattern she had documented over the past 6 weeks, starting with the vague unease reported by 11 separate candidates, moving through Priya's professional observation about his readiness for real partnership, and finally arriving at the 3 specific accounts: Grace's 9-minute interview, Natalie's discomfort at his pointed questions about loyalty, Claire's memory of his rigid philosophy about staying no matter how unhappy a relationship became. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression growing more strained with each account, though he did not deny any of it, did not offer the smooth, practiced explanations Sophia had watched him give so easily during their first meeting. When Elena finished, the room fell into a heavy silence, and it was Sophia who finally broke it, gently. "I spoke with Charlotte," she said carefully, not directly, through Elena. "But I already knew part of her story before any of this began, from a conversation I had with her at a dinner party, years before I ever knew your name." Daniel's face went pale, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring down at his hands, as though searching them for an answer he could not find anywhere else. "What did she say?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia considered her words carefully before answering, aware that what she said next would either open a door Daniel had kept sealed for 3 years, or close it permanently. She told him, as gently as she could manage, about Charlotte's description of feeling smaller and smaller, of losing herself so gradually she had not recognized it happening until she was already standing outside the relationship, looking back at a version of herself she barely remembered. Daniel's composure, the careful, practiced control that had carried him through 22 interviews without a single visible crack, finally broke completely. He put his head in his hands, and for a long moment, the successful, controlled businessman who had walked into Elena's office 6 weeks earlier with a rigid list of requirements for the perfect partner disappeared entirely, replaced by someone far younger, far more frightened, and far more honest than anyone in that room had yet seen him be. "I did not think I was doing that," he said, his voice thick with something between grief and disbelief. "I thought I was just trying to protect what we had. I thought if I could just make sure she would not leave the way my father left, everything would be fine. I never once thought about what it might actually be doing to her while I was doing it." Elena and Sophia exchanged a glance, both recognizing, in that raw, unguarded moment, that they were witnessing something neither of them had fully expected: a man beginning, however painfully, to see clearly for the first time the shape of the pattern that had governed his entire adult life. But recognizing it, Sophia thought quietly, watching Daniel's shaking hands, was only the very first step of a much longer journey, one that would require far more than a single difficult conversation in a small agency office to complete. Elena poured Daniel a glass of water and set it in front of him, giving him a moment before continuing. "When you talked about wanting someone who would never leave," she said gently, "do you understand now why that frightened the women you were meeting, rather than reassuring them?" Daniel nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, an action so unlike the composed man who had walked into her office 6 weeks earlier, that Elena found herself feeling something unexpected, a kind of cautious sympathy she had not anticipated feeling for a client whose actions had caused real harm to people she cared about protecting. "I think I have been treating relationships like a wall to keep people in," he said quietly, "rather than a door they choose to walk through every day. My mother said something similar to me a few weeks ago, and I dismissed it because it was easier than actually listening." Sophia leaned forward slightly. "Do you know why you built the wall in the first place?" she asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer from their conversation at dinner. "My father," Daniel said. "He did not leave all at once. He left slowly, over years, missing things, showing up less, until one day he was just gone, and living a completely different life somewhere else, as though we had never mattered to him at all. I think some part of me decided very young that if I ever loved someone, I needed to make absolutely certain they could never do that to me. I just never understood that trying to guarantee someone could not leave was its own kind of leaving. It pushes people out just as surely, only slower, and with more blame attached to them for feeling suffocated." The room was quiet for a long moment after that admission, the kind of quiet that carries weight rather than emptiness. Elena finally spoke, her tone shifting from the careful neutrality of the earlier conversation into something more direct. "I have to be honest with you about where this leaves the agency," she said. "I do not think I can continue arranging interviews for you while this pattern remains unaddressed. Not because I think you are a bad person, Daniel. I do not believe that. But my responsibility is to every candidate who trusts me enough to sit across from a stranger I have introduced them to, and I cannot in good conscience keep doing that until I have real confidence something has actually changed, not just been acknowledged in a single difficult conversation." Daniel absorbed this without argument, nodding slowly, some of the color returning to his face, now that the initial shock of the confrontation had begun to settle into something more like clarity. "That is fair," he said. "I would not trust myself right now either, if I were in your position." He turned to Sophia then, his expression uncertain, almost apologetic. "I understand if you want nothing further to do with any of this," he said. "I would not blame you. You came here as a favor, essentially, to warn other women about a pattern you recognized before I did myself." Sophia considered her answer carefully. "I am not interested in being your partner while any of this remains unresolved," she said honestly. "I want to be clear about that, so there is no confusion. But I also do not think confrontation, without any path forward, accomplishes very much beyond making everyone in this room feel like something important has happened. If you are serious about actually examining this, rather than simply feeling bad about it for a week, and then quietly returning to old patterns once the discomfort fades, there are people who can help you do that properly. A therapist, ideally one who specializes in exactly this kind of pattern, not a matchmaking agency, and not me." Daniel absorbed this with a kind of quiet humility that had been entirely absent from either of his previous meetings with her, and Elena, watching the exchange, felt something shift in her understanding of what this whole difficult morning might ultimately accomplish. Not a fairy tale ending, not a sudden transformation, but perhaps something more honest and more useful. A first genuine step in a much longer process that no single conversation could complete on its own. "I will find someone," Daniel said finally. "I do not know exactly what that process looks like, but I think I have avoided it for long enough. 3 years is a long time to keep running the same pattern and calling it caution." Elena nodded, relief visible in her posture for the first time since the meeting began. "I am glad to hear that," she said. "And Daniel, I want you to know, this conversation does not erase what happened with Charlotte, or with the other women who felt something was wrong, without fully understanding what. But it is a beginning. What you do with it from here is entirely up to you." The meeting ended shortly after, without the neat resolution any of them might have wished for, but with something more valuable in its place. A fragile, honest beginning, built on difficult truths, finally spoken aloud, instead of carefully managed and hidden away. Daniel left the office alone, walking slowly down the narrow staircase of the converted townhouse, the late morning light catching him differently than it had when he arrived, though none of the 3 women watching him go could yet say for certain whether that difference would hold, or whether, once the discomfort of the morning faded, he would find a way to quietly retreat back into the careful, controlled patterns that had protected him, however imperfectly, for so many years. 2 weeks passed before Elena heard from Daniel again, and in that time, the agency continued its normal work. Other clients, other introductions, the quiet rhythm of a business that had, for 6 strange weeks, been consumed almost entirely by a single complicated case. Elena had not sent the formal letter pausing Daniel's search. It had become unnecessary the moment he agreed, in her office that difficult morning, to step back from the process voluntarily. But she thought about him often during those 2 weeks, wondering whether the honesty of that conversation had taken root or simply faded into another item on a long list of things Daniel Whitfield had successfully avoided examining. Sophia, for her part, returned to her work with a full schedule of renovation projects, though she found her mind wandering back to the conversation in Elena's office more often than she expected. She was not waiting for Daniel, not in any romantic sense, but she found herself curious, in the way she was curious about any structure she had once inspected and found compromised, whether the necessary repairs would actually be made, or whether the building would simply be left standing on its damaged foundation, until something eventually gave way. The message came on a Tuesday afternoon, sent not to Sophia directly, since Daniel did not have her personal contact information, but through Elena, who forwarded it, along with her own brief note, explaining that she had reviewed it, and felt comfortable passing it forward. I found a therapist, the message read. Her name is Dr. Renata Osei, and I have had 3 sessions with her so far. I am not writing to ask for anything, and I understand if you do not want to respond at all. I only wanted you to know that the conversation in Elena's office was not something I walked away from and forgot. I think about it every day. I am beginning to understand things about myself I spent 37 years successfully avoiding, and it has not been easy, but I believe it is necessary. Thank you for seeing something I could not see myself, and for caring enough about strangers to make sure someone eventually would. Sophia read the message several times before deciding how to respond, aware that whatever she wrote next would set the tone for whatever came after. She was not interested in rushing back into a relationship with a man whose pattern of harm, however sympathetically explained, had already left real damage in its wake. But she also believed, as she had told Daniel directly in Elena's office, that genuine change deserved acknowledgement when it appeared to be genuinely underway. She wrote back simply, "I am glad you found someone qualified to help. That work matters, regardless of what happens between us. Take the time you need, and do it for yourself, not for anyone else's approval, including mine." Meanwhile, at Dr. Osei's office across the city, Daniel was beginning the slow, uncomfortable process of examining a pattern he had spent his entire adult life building, without ever fully understanding its origins. Dr. Osei, a calm, direct woman in her 50s with a gift for asking questions that landed somewhere between gentle and unflinching, had spent their first 2 sessions simply gathering history: Daniel's childhood, his father's slow disappearance, his mother's anxious, controlling love, the engagement to Charlotte, and its painful end. In their 3rd session, she asked him a question that echoed uncomfortably close to something Sophia had said weeks earlier, though Dr. Osei had no way of knowing that. "You have described control as protection," she said, as though tightening your grip on a relationship was the same thing as caring for it. "What do you think would happen if you loved someone without trying to guarantee the outcome at all?" Daniel sat with the question for a long time before answering, longer than he had sat with almost any question in his adult life. "I think I would be terrified," he admitted finally. "I think I have spent so long trying to control whether people leave that I never learned how to simply be present with someone and let the outcome be uncertain. That uncertainty feels like standing at the edge of something with no railing." "That is a very honest answer," Dr. Osei said, "and an important one. Because the truth is, Daniel, there has never been a railing. Not for you, not for anyone. Every relationship carries the risk that the other person might choose to leave. What you built instead of accepting that risk was a structure designed to remove the other person's choice entirely, disguised as devotion. That structure did not protect you from loss. It simply guaranteed a different, quieter kind of loss. One where the person stays physically present while slowly disappearing anyway. The way Charlotte described feeling smaller and smaller until there was nothing left to see." The words landed hard, and Daniel spent the rest of that session largely in silence, absorbing something he suspected he would need many more months, perhaps years, to fully integrate. He left Dr. Osei's office that afternoon, feeling raw in a way that had become oddly familiar over the past 2 weeks. No longer the composed, controlled businessman who had walked into Elena's office with a rigid spreadsheet of requirements, but not yet certain what, exactly, he was becoming instead. He began writing letters that week, not to send, but for himself, a practice Dr. Osei suggested as a way of processing thoughts too large and unwieldy to examine only in conversation. He wrote to his father first, a letter full of questions he had never been allowed to ask as a child, about why leaving had happened so slowly, whether his father had understood the damage the gradual disappearance caused, more than a sudden departure ever could have. He wrote to his mother next, gentler than the letter to his father, acknowledging the fear that had shaped her controlling love, without excusing the ways that fear had been passed down to him, without either of them ever naming it clearly. And finally, though it took him 3 attempts over as many days before he managed to finish it, he wrote a letter to Charlotte. He did not send this one either, at least not right away, uncertain whether reaching out to her at all would help her healing, or simply reopen something she had worked hard to close. But he wrote it anyway, because Dr. Osei had told him that understanding harm honestly, even privately, mattered regardless of whether the person harmed ever read the words. "I am sorry," the letter began, For a kind of harm I did not have the language to see clearly while I was causing it. You told me, the night you left, that I made you feel like you were disappearing, and I spent 3 years telling myself you were simply being dramatic. I understand now that you were describing something precise and true, something I am only beginning to recognize in myself with real help. I do not expect forgiveness, and I am not asking for anything from you now. I only wanted you to know that what you said that night was heard, even if it took me far too long to actually listen. While Daniel worked through his sessions with Dr. Osei, Elena had begun a project of her own, one born directly from the uncomfortable weeks she had spent uncovering a pattern she should, by her own private admission, have noticed sooner. She called a meeting with Nadia one evening, after the office had closed. The two of them sitting together over takeout containers, a whiteboard between them covered in notes neither of them had expected to be writing when the year began. We cannot keep relying on instinct alone, Elena said, tapping the whiteboard where she had listed, in careful columns, every warning sign that had appeared across Daniel's case, the short interviews, the pointed questions about loyalty and leaving, the discomfort candidates struggled to articulate even to themselves. If we had asked better questions during intake, if we had built in a way for candidates to report concerns without needing months to accumulate before anyone took them seriously, we might have caught this after 3 interviews instead of 22. Nadia nodded, already sketching out ideas of her own, drawing on the psychology background that had first made her suspicious of Daniel's pattern weeks before Elena was ready to take it seriously. What if we added a structured follow-up after every interview, she suggested, not just an optional call, but a required check-in with a specific set of questions designed to surface exactly this kind of pattern. Did you feel free to disagree with him? Did you feel like your answers were being evaluated against something you could not see? Did anything about the conversation make you feel smaller by the end of it than you did at the beginning? Elena wrote the questions down carefully, recognizing immediately that they would have caught Daniel's pattern within the first 3 or 4 interviews, rather than the 22 it had actually taken. She thought of Grace Bellamy's 9-minute interview, of Claire Wynn's unsettling memory that had waited weeks before she found the courage to call, of Priya's professional instinct that had, thankfully, prompted her to speak up almost immediately, rather than staying silent the way so many of the others had. If she had been listening more carefully from the beginning, she realized, she might have spared at least a dozen women the quiet, unnamed discomfort of an interview that left them unsettled without ever fully understanding why. Over the following weeks, Elena and Nadia rebuilt significant portions of the agency's intake and follow-up process, adding the new questions, training themselves to take vague, unexplained discomfort seriously, rather than filing it away as ordinary pickiness or incompatibility. They reached out individually to several of the women who had passed through Daniel's interviews, not to alarm them, but to check in, to let them know, gently, that the agency had identified a pattern of concern and had taken steps to address it. Most of the women responded with relief rather than anger, grateful that their instincts, which they had doubted or dismissed at the time, had ultimately been validated by people in a position to act on them. Grace Bellamy, when Elena called her personally, was quiet for a long moment before responding. I always wondered if I imagined it, she admitted. It is strange how much lighter something feels once you know you were not imagining it after all. Sophia, meanwhile, found herself thinking often about her own past during those weeks, about the marriage that had ended 5 years earlier, quietly and without the same clear pattern of harm that had defined Daniel and Charlotte's relationship, but not entirely without its own lessons about the ways 2 people could slowly stop truly seeing each other. She had done her own work in the years since, therapy of her own, long conversations with friends who had helped her understand what she had and had not been responsible for in that marriage's end. She recognized, watching Daniel's slow, painful process from a careful distance, something of her own earlier journey reflected back at her, though she was careful not to let that recognition turn into excusing behavior that had caused real harm to people who deserved better. She began, cautiously, exchanging occasional messages with Daniel over the following month, nothing that resembled dating, but a kind of careful, honest correspondence that neither of them rushed. He told her, in one message, about the letter he had written to Charlotte and never sent. She told him, in return, about her own unsent letters from years earlier, the ones she had eventually worked up the courage to send, and the strange, complicated relief that had followed regardless of how her ex-husband had responded to them. "It does not fix everything," she wrote to him one evening. "Sending the truth into the world does not erase what happened before you were ready to see it clearly. But it does something important anyway. It stops the truth from living only inside you, where it has nowhere to go, except back into the same patterns that created it in the first place." Daniel read that message several times before setting his phone down, sitting quietly in his study, the same room where he had once kept a color-coded spreadsheet, reducing 23 women to rows of data and compatibility scores. The spreadsheet remained on his laptop, untouched now for over a month, a relic of a version of himself he was slowly, painfully, beginning to leave behind, though he understood, with a clarity Dr. Osei had helped him find, that leaving behind an old pattern was rarely a single decisive act, and far more often, a long, uneven process of choosing, again and again, not to return to what once felt safe, simply because it was familiar. 3 months after the difficult morning in Elena's office, Daniel sent the letter to Charlotte. He had rewritten it 4 more times since first drafting it, each version slightly less focused on his own guilt, and slightly more focused on the simple, clear acknowledgement Dr. Osei had encouraged him to aim for. Not an apology that asked Charlotte to comfort him for his own discomfort, but one that centered what she had actually experienced and survived. He did not expect a response, and for 2 weeks, he received none, a silence he had, with considerable effort, learned to sit with, rather than interpret as catastrophe, the way he might have done a year earlier. When Charlotte finally wrote back, her message was short, careful, and more generous than Daniel had allowed himself to hope for. "Thank you for writing this," she said. "I do not think I am ready to have a longer conversation, and I am not sure I ever will be. But I am glad you understand now what I could not fully explain while I was still living inside it. I hope you continue the work you described. Not for me. For whoever comes after me, if anyone does." Daniel read the message, standing in his kitchen, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, crying without trying to stop himself, or explain the tears away, as an overreaction. It was not relief exactly, and it was not quite grief either, but something that held both at once. A recognition that healing rarely arrived as a single triumphant moment, and far more often as a series of small, honest exchanges that asked for nothing in return, except the willingness to finally see clearly. Around the same time, Sophia was overseeing the final stages of the theater renovation she had been working on for nearly a year, a project that had tested every part of her expertise, structural repairs hidden behind original architectural details that could not be altered without losing the building's historic character. She often thought, during the long hours spent on site checking beams and supports, about the conversation she had once had with Daniel about cracked foundations, and how strange it was that an offhand professional metaphor had ended up describing something so much larger than either of them had initially understood. She and Daniel continued their careful correspondence throughout those months, meeting occasionally for coffee, never rushing toward anything more, both of them treating the slow rebuilding of trust with the same patience Sophia brought to the theater's restoration, understanding that skipping steps in either process only created problems that would resurface later, often in worse form than if they had been addressed properly from the beginning. During one of these coffee meetings, Daniel told her something he had not shared with anyone else yet, not even Dr. Osei in full detail. "I have been thinking about Elena's agency," he said, "about the other women, the ones who never came forward, who might still be walking around with an unexplained discomfort they never got the chance to understand or validate. I asked Elena if there was a way I could help make sure this does not happen again to someone else, through her agency or otherwise. I do not know exactly what that looks like yet, but I want to do something with what I have learned, beyond just fixing myself quietly and moving on." Sophia considered this carefully before responding. "That sounds like a meaningful thing to want," she said. "Just be careful that it comes from genuine responsibility, and not from a need to prove you have changed enough to earn something back. Those are different motivations, and they lead to very different outcomes." Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the distinction immediately. A sign, Sophia thought privately, of how much genuine self-awareness he had built over the past several months. "I think you are right," he said. "I will need to sit with that before I decide what, if anything, to actually do." He raised the idea with Elena the following week, not as a business proposal, but as a genuine question about how his experience might be useful in preventing similar harm in the future. Elena, who had spent the past several months rebuilding her intake process with Nadia, listened carefully before responding. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I think the most useful thing you can do right now is simply continue your own work, quietly, without needing it to become a project or a redemption story. If in a year, or 2 years, you are still doing the work, still growing, still honest about what happened and why, then perhaps there is a conversation to have about how your experience might help others recognize similar patterns in themselves before they cause the kind of harm you caused. But that conversation belongs to a future version of you that does not exist yet, not to the version sitting in my office today, still only a few months into therapy." Daniel accepted this without argument, recognizing in Elena's careful boundary the same kind of honest, unflinching feedback Dr. Osei had been offering him for months, a refusal to let him rush toward resolution simply because sitting with the discomfort of an unfinished process felt harder than declaring himself fixed. That evening, back in his study, Daniel opened his laptop for the first time in weeks and found the old spreadsheet still sitting in his files, 22 rows of women, reduced to compatibility scores and clinical notes, a document that had once represented, to him, careful thoroughness, and now represented something closer to evidence of a pattern he was still learning to fully understand. He did not delete it. Dr. Osei had taught him that erasing evidence of old patterns rarely helped anyone heal from them, and instead created a false sense that the pattern itself had disappeared along with its record. Instead, he moved the file into a folder labeled simply "Before," and beside it, he created a new, empty document he did not yet know how to fill, one without columns, without scores, without any of the careful, clinical distance that had once made relationships feel manageable to him. Elena's new intake process, meanwhile, had already begun proving its worth in ways she had not fully anticipated when she and Nadia first sketched it out on the whiteboard months earlier. A new client, a confident, well-spoken man named Peter Ellsworth, had come through the agency shortly after the changes were implemented, and within his second interview, the new follow-up questions surfaced a pattern eerily similar to Daniel's, though far less developed, and thankfully, caught much earlier in its progression. The candidate he had met, a graphic designer named Ruby Sanderson, reported during her structured follow-up call that she had felt, in her words, quietly tested throughout their conversation, asked repeatedly about her past relationships in a way that seemed less curious than evaluative, as though he were searching for evidence she might be prone to leaving. Nadia flagged the report immediately, and Elena, drawing directly on what she had learned through Daniel's case, arranged a careful conversation with Peter before continuing his search further, laying out the pattern gently but clearly, the same way she once wished someone had done for Daniel after only 2 or 3 interviews instead of 22. Peter, to Elena's genuine relief, responded with something closer to Daniel's eventual openness than his early defensiveness, a willingness to consider that his own past, a difficult divorce that had left him more guarded than he had realized, might be shaping his search for a partner in ways he had not previously examined. Elena recommended a therapist, paused his search for a month, and felt, watching him leave her office that day, a small but meaningful sense that the painful lessons of the previous months were already beginning to protect people who might otherwise have walked, unknowingly, into the same quiet harm Daniel's earlier candidates had experienced. She mentioned this to Daniel during one of their occasional check-ins, careful not to frame it as praise for him directly, but as evidence that the system built in response to his case was working as intended. Daniel absorbed the news quietly, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions, a genuine relief that Ruby Sanderson had been spared a longer, more damaging pattern of interviews, alongside a persistent discomfort at being, even indirectly, the origin point for a lesson learned through real harm to real people. "That is good," he said finally. "I am glad the changes are working. I just wish they had not needed to be built out of what happened to Charlotte and the others first." Elena nodded, understanding the weight in his voice. "That is often how meaningful change happens, unfortunately," she said, rarely proactively, usually because something went wrong first, and someone finally paid enough attention to make sure it did not keep happening the same way. It does not erase the original harm. But it does mean the harm was not entirely without consequence or purpose in the end. Sophia, hearing about Peter Ellsworth's case secondhand through Daniel, found herself reflecting on her own evolving feelings about their continued correspondence. She had been careful, throughout the months since their difficult second interview, not to rush toward anything resembling a real relationship, aware that both her own history and Daniel's ongoing process demanded patience rather than urgency. But she also noticed, with some surprise, that she looked forward to their occasional coffee meetings more than she had expected to, drawn not to the composed, controlled version of Daniel she had first met, but to the more honest, uncertain version that had slowly emerged in the months since. She discussed this, carefully, with a close friend one evening, laying out the complicated shape of her feelings, admiration for the real work Daniel appeared to be doing, genuine caution, given what that work had been necessary to address in the first place, and a growing, if reluctant, interest in seeing where their careful correspondence might eventually lead. "You are allowed to be curious about someone who is genuinely doing the work," her friend said, "without that curiosity meaning you have decided anything yet. Watching someone change is not the same as promising to build a life with them. You get to keep watching for as long as you need to, and decide later, once you actually trust what you are seeing." Sophia held on to that distinction carefully over the following weeks, allowing herself the curiosity, without forcing it into a decision, before she was ready to make one, continuing to meet Daniel occasionally, continuing to notice, each time, small signs of genuine growth, alongside the inevitable moments where old patterns still surfaced, a flicker of anxious control quickly caught and named rather than acted upon, a question about her plans that carried, just barely, an old echo of testing loyalty before he caught himself and reframed it into simple, ordinary curiosity instead. It was slow, uneven progress, the kind Dr. Osei had warned him to expect from the very first session, and neither Sophia nor Daniel pretended otherwise, both of them understanding, in their own ways, that whatever eventually grew between them, if anything did, would need to be built far more carefully than anything Daniel had attempted before, on a foundation examined honestly, rather than simply reinforced and hidden from view. He stared at the blank page for a long time that night, uncertain what belonged there, only certain that whatever eventually filled it would need to be built on something sturdier than the fear that had shaped everything he tried to build before. 6 months after the confrontation in Elena's office, Daniel reached a milestone in his work with Dr. Osei that he had not anticipated arriving at so soon, though she was careful to remind him, each time he mentioned it, that milestones in this kind of work rarely marked an ending, only a clearer view of how much further the road actually extended. "I think I finally understand the difference between loving someone and needing them to stay," he told her during one session, sitting in the same chair he had occupied nervously 6 months earlier, though his posture now carried none of the earlier defensiveness. "For most of my life, I treated those two things as the same, as though love that did not come with a guarantee was not really love at all. But a guarantee is not something another person can give you. It is something you try to extract from them, and every time you extract it, you are taking away a small piece of their freedom to actually choose you." Dr. Osei nodded, allowing the observation to sit in the room for a moment before responding. "That is an important distinction," she said. "But I want you to notice something about how you just described it. You framed it entirely in terms of what you were taking from others. I would like you to also consider what the guarantee was costing you, because control does not just harm the person being controlled. It also keeps the person doing the controlling from ever experiencing what it actually feels like to be loved freely, without coercion. You have spent years protecting yourself from the pain of being left, and in doing so, you also protected yourself from ever fully receiving love that was not obligated to stay." Daniel sat with this for a long moment, feeling something shift in his understanding that had not quite surfaced in 6 months of careful, incremental work. He thought of Sophia, of their slow, careful correspondence over the past several months, of the curiosity he felt growing steadily whenever they met, a curiosity he had, until this exact moment, mostly framed around whether he was becoming someone deserving of her continued attention, rather than considering what it might mean to actually receive her care freely, without needing to earn or secure it permanently. "I do not think I know how to do that yet," he admitted. "Receive something without immediately trying to make sure I cannot lose it." "That is all right," Dr. Osei said. "Very few people are taught how to do that well. It is a skill, like any other, and it takes practice, usually clumsy practice at first, before it becomes something closer to natural. Around this same period, Elena's agency reached its own kind of milestone. 1 year since the new intake and follow-up process had been implemented, and Elena spent an evening reviewing the data Nadia had carefully compiled over the preceding 12 months. The numbers told a clear story. Concerning patterns, once caught only after they had already caused significant harm across dozens of interviews, were now being flagged, on average, within the first 2 or 3 meetings, giving Elena and Nadia the opportunity to intervene early, offering resources, pausing searches, and in a handful of cases, ending client relationships entirely when the underlying pattern proved too severe or too resistant to acknowledgement for the agency to continue in good conscience. "We should be proud of this," Nadia said, looking over the final report with Elena late one evening, the two of them the only ones left in the small office, the same office where, exactly a year earlier, Sophia had first laid out the memory of a dinner party conversation that changed everything that followed. "I am proud of it," Elena said, "but I also think we need to remember where it came from. 22 women who trusted this agency to look out for them, and it took us far too long to notice what several of them had already sensed instinctively. I do not ever want to build a system so proud of catching problems early that we forget how badly we failed to catch this one in time." Nadia nodded, understanding the careful balance Elena was trying to hold. Genuine progress alongside genuine accountability. Neither one allowed to erase or excuse the other. They closed the office that evening with a quiet sense of purpose neither of them had felt quite so clearly when the agency's work had simply been about finding good matches. A sense that their work now carried a weight and responsibility that extended well beyond simple compatibility scores and successful introductions. Sophia, meanwhile, had begun noticing something in herself over those same months that she had not expected. A gradual softening of the careful caution she had maintained since the early days of understanding Daniel's pattern, replaced slowly by something that felt, cautiously, like genuine trust, rather than simple curiosity. She discussed this shift with Dr. Osei directly. In a joint session Daniel had asked her to consider attending, not to work through anything specifically between them, but so that Sophia could ask the questions she had been carrying privately for months, in an environment where honest answers were the entire point of the conversation. "How do I know the difference between real change and someone who has simply learned better language for the same underlying pattern?" Sophia asked directly, watching Dr. Osei's face carefully for any sign of defensiveness on Daniel's behalf. Dr. Osei did not answer immediately, considering the question with the same careful attention she brought to every difficult moment in her sessions with Daniel. "That is a fair and important question," she said finally. "And honestly, the only real answer is time, combined with attention to what happens under pressure, not when things are calm and everything is going well, but when something genuinely difficult arises, a disagreement, a moment of real uncertainty, a situation where the old pattern would have once taken over automatically. Real change shows up most clearly in those moments, not in how someone talks about change when nothing is actually being tested." Sophia absorbed this carefully, understanding it as both an honest answer and, in its own way, an invitation to keep watching, rather than to trust prematurely, simply because the conversation had gone well. She left that session with a clearer sense of what she was actually looking for going forward. Not perfect language, not a flawless account of personal growth, but evidence, gathered slowly and carefully over time, of how Daniel behaved when the stakes were real, and the old, familiar patterns would have once taken control without him even noticing. That test, she suspected, though she did not yet know exactly when or how it would arrive, was still waiting somewhere ahead of both of them. It arrived sooner than either of them expected, on an ordinary Thursday evening that began with nothing more dramatic than a scheduling conflict. Sophia had planned to attend a professional conference in another city, a 4-day trip she had committed to months earlier, before her correspondence with Daniel had deepened into something neither of them had fully named yet. She mentioned the trip casually over dinner, expecting nothing more than polite interest, and watched, with careful attention, as something flickered briefly across Daniel's face before he composed himself. "That sounds like a great opportunity," he said, his tone measured in a way that told Sophia he was working hard to keep it steady. 4 days is a long time, though. Will you have much time to talk while you are there?" Sophia noticed the question immediately for what it was. Not simple curiosity, but the faint shape of an old pattern, reasserting itself. A need to maintain a certain level of contact and reassurance, even during her time away, dressed carefully enough that it might have passed unnoticed by anyone not specifically watching for it. She considered, for a moment, letting it go, softening her answer to reassure him the way she might have done automatically months earlier, before she understood what she was actually looking for. Instead, she chose honesty. "I do not know exactly," she said. "I will be busy most of the days with sessions and networking events. I might not have much time to check in regularly, and I think that is all right. It does not mean anything is wrong between us. It just means I will be focused on something important to my own work for a few days." She watched him carefully as she said it, aware that this small, ordinary moment was exactly the kind of test Dr. Osei had described. Not a dramatic crisis, but an everyday situation, carrying, underneath its surface, the old familiar shape of his deepest fear, the possibility of someone stepping slightly out of reach and never fully returning. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Sophia could see him working through something internally, an old, automatic response fighting against months of careful, deliberate practice. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness that told her he was choosing his words with real effort, rather than simply reciting something rehearsed in therapy. "I notice I want to ask you to promise you will call every night," he said slowly. "I can feel that want very clearly right now. And I also know, because I have spent 6 months learning this the hard way, that asking you for that promise would not actually be about missing you. It would be about trying to control something I cannot control, which is whether you are thinking about me while you are away. So I am not going to ask for that. I am going to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, and trust that if something is wrong, you will tell me, and if nothing is wrong, the silence does not mean anything, except that you are living your life, which is exactly what I want for you." Sophia felt something settle in her chest as she listened, a recognition that what she was witnessing was not a perfect performance of change, but something far more convincing, the visible effort of a man actively choosing a different response than the one his old pattern would have produced automatically. It was not smooth, it was not entirely comfortable, for either of them, but it was real in a way that no carefully worded message or therapy session account could have fully conveyed. "Thank you for telling me that honestly," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand briefly. "That matters more to me than any promise to call every night ever could." The 4 days of Sophia's conference passed with only 2 brief messages exchanged between them, both initiated by Sophia during natural breaks in her schedule, neither one carrying the anxious undertone that might once have characterized Daniel's side of a similar exchange. When she returned, he met her at the airport, not with the desperate relief of someone who had spent 4 days in quiet anguish, but with the steady, grounded warmth of someone who had used the time productively, attending an extra session with Dr. Osei, working late on a project he had been putting off, trusting, however imperfectly, that the distance did not threaten what existed between them. "How was it?" he asked, taking her bag without being asked, a small, ordinary gesture that nonetheless carried, for both of them, the quiet weight of everything that had changed since a difficult confrontation in a small agency office nearly 7 months earlier. "Good," Sophia said, smiling for the first time in days, without any complicated undercurrent beneath it. "Really good, actually." And walking together toward the parking garage, neither of them spoke of the test the past 4 days had quietly represented, though both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that something important had just been proven, not perfectly, not without effort, but genuinely, in exactly the way Dr. Osei had said real change would eventually show itself. Nearly a year after the 23rd interview that had quietly changed the direction of so many lives, Elena sat in her office, reviewing a request that had arrived unexpectedly that morning, a message from a journalist working on a feature about the ethics and evolution of modern matchmaking, asking whether Elena would be willing to share her agency's story, including the changes she had made to her intake process over the past year. Elena considered the request carefully before responding, aware that sharing the story publicly would require a level of honesty about her own early failures that most business owners would understandably prefer to keep private. But she also thought of Grace Bellamy's relief at finally being believed, Of Ruby Sanderson's pattern caught early because of lessons learned through real harm. Of the quiet, ongoing work Daniel continued with Dr. Osei. And she decided the story was worth telling honestly, mistakes included, if it might help other agencies, other matchmakers, other people entirely outside her industry recognize similar patterns before they caused similar damage. She called Sophia and Daniel separately, asking whether they would be willing to speak with the journalist, making clear that neither of them was obligated to participate, and that she would tell the story carefully and anonymously if either of them preferred to stay out of it entirely. Daniel thought about the request for several days before responding, discussing it at length with Dr. Osei, who reminded him gently of the distinction Sophia had once drawn for him, the difference between wanting to help because it served a genuine purpose and wanting to help because it offered a tidy resolution to a story he was still, in reality, only partway through living. "I do not think I am ready to be a public example of change," he told Elena finally, "not because I am ashamed of the work, but because I do not want my story to become a performance of growth rather than the actual, ongoing, sometimes clumsy practice of it. If sharing what happened helps other agencies build better systems, I support that completely. I would just rather remain anonymous in it, at least for now." Elena respected this without argument, and when the article was eventually published 2 months later, it told the story carefully, changing names and identifying details, focusing less on Daniel specifically, and more on the broader lesson Elena and Nadia had learned, that patterns of quiet, hard-to-name harm, often hid in plain sight, dismissed as pickiness or incompatibility, until enough small, individually dismissible reports accumulated into something impossible to ignore. The article closed with a quote from Elena that Nadia later told her was the truest thing she had ever said about their work. "The absence of obvious cruelty does not mean the absence of harm," Elena told the journalist. "Some of the deepest damage happens so slowly and so quietly that even the person causing it does not recognize what they are doing until someone finally looks closely enough and cares enough to name the pattern out loud." The article, though it never named Daniel directly, reached him anyway, forwarded by a colleague who had no idea of its personal significance, simply thinking it was an interesting piece about relationships and matchmaking. Daniel read it twice, recognizing pieces of his own story, reflected carefully back at him, through the careful, anonymized language Elena had used, and felt, reading it, not exposure or shame, but something closer to a strange, quiet gratitude, that his difficult, painful process had contributed to something that might genuinely help someone else recognize a similar pattern earlier than he had managed to. He shared the article with Sophia that evening, and the two of them sat together reading it a second time, side by side, neither of them speaking for a long moment after they finished. "Do you ever regret how we met?" Daniel asked finally, the question carrying a vulnerability that would have been unimaginable from the composed, controlled man who had walked into Elena's office nearly a year earlier. All the ways it started, the 22 other interviews, everything Elena and Nadia had to uncover before either of us understood what was actually happening. Sophia considered the question seriously, the way she considered every question Daniel asked her now, understanding that his willingness to ask it honestly, without needing a specific reassuring answer, was itself evidence of exactly how much had changed. "I do not think regret is quite the right word," she said finally. "I think about Charlotte often, and about the other women who were hurt before either of us understood what was happening. I do not think anything about how we met erases that harm or makes it acceptable simply because something good eventually grew out of paying attention to it. But I also do not regret being the person who noticed, or being willing to stay curious long enough to understand you honestly, rather than walking away the moment things became complicated. Both things can be true at once. The harm mattered, and so does everything that came after it, if the work continues to be real." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing this with the same careful attention he had learned to bring to difficult truths over the past year, no longer reaching immediately for reassurance or resolution, but allowing complicated things to remain complicated, without needing to simplify them into something more comfortable. That evening, after Sophia left, Daniel opened the blank document he had created months earlier, the one meant to eventually replace the old spreadsheet of compatibility scores and clinical evaluations, and for the first time, he began to write something into it, not a list of requirements, not a system for managing risk, but a simple, honest reflection on what he had learned over the past year, about love, about control, and about the difference between building a life with someone and building a cage around them. Love is not something you can secure permanently through vigilance, he wrote. It exists only in the present, chosen freely, again and again, by two people who remain free to leave and choose, instead, to stay. I spent most of my life trying to eliminate that freedom, because it frightened me too much to hold. I am only now learning that the freedom itself is not the danger. It is the only thing that makes staying mean anything at all. A few weeks after the article was published, Elena received an unexpected visit from Priya Nandan, the therapist whose gentle professional instinct had been among the very first warnings in her private notebook, long before the pattern had fully revealed itself. Priya had read the article without knowing it concerned the same client, and something about its careful description of quiet, hard-to-name harm had prompted her to reach out to Elena directly, curious whether her instinct from that brief interview so long ago had ever been confirmed. It was him, was it not? Priya said, once she and Elena were seated together in the small office. The man I met that day. I have thought about that interview many times since, wondering if I imagined the feeling I described in my message to you. Elena considered how much to share, mindful of the privacy she had promised Daniel, but decided a general acknowledgement, without unnecessary detail, honored both her commitment to him and her respect for Priya's professional instinct. It was him, she confirmed, and your instinct was not imagined. It was, in fact, one of the very first pieces of evidence that helped us eventually understand what was happening. Priya nodded slowly, a quiet satisfaction settling over her features. Not triumph exactly, but the particular relief of a trained professional whose careful, evidence-based instincts had been proven sound. I am glad I said something, she said. I almost did not, you know. I told myself it was not really my place, that I had only spent an hour with the man, that perhaps I was reading too much into a single uncomfortable moment. It is strange how easy it is to talk ourselves out of trusting what we clearly sense, especially when nothing dramatic has actually happened to justify the feeling. That observation stayed with Elena long after Priya left, and she found herself repeating it to Nadia later that week as they reviewed the ongoing improvements to their intake process. It is strange how easy it is to talk ourselves out of trusting what we sense, she said, and Nadia, listening, suggested they add a version of that exact sentiment directly into the training materials they had begun developing, not just for their own staff, but for the handful of other agencies that had reached out since the article's publication, curious about adopting similar safeguards into their own processes. Grace Bellamy, too, reached out once more during this period, not with new concerns, but with an update she thought Elena would want to hear. She had, in the months since their earlier conversation, begun dating someone new. A kind, steady man she had met through entirely different circumstances, and she wanted Elena to know that the 9-minute interview with Daniel, once a source of quiet, unexplained unease, no longer carried the same weight it once had. I do not think about it very often anymore, Grace said, but when I do, I am glad someone eventually took it seriously. It matters, being believed, even months later, even after the moment itself has mostly faded. Elena carried these conversations with her through the following weeks, each one a small, quiet confirmation that the difficult, uncomfortable work of the previous year had mattered beyond the specific outcome between Daniel and Sophia, that the ripples of paying closer attention had extended outward in ways she could not have fully predicted when she first opened that private notebook, uncertain whether her instincts were worth trusting or simply the pickiness of an unusually demanding client. She thought, often, about the version of herself who had almost dismissed Nadia's early concerns, who had told herself repeatedly that Daniel's pattern of rejections was ordinary rather than significant, and she understood, with the clarity that only comes from looking back at a mistake nearly made, how easily the entire situation could have continued indefinitely. 22 interviews becoming 30, becoming 50, each one leaving behind another woman with an unexplained discomfort she talked herself out of, trusting, exactly the way Priya had almost done, exactly the way Elena herself very nearly had. That understanding shaped everything about how she ran the agency going forward, not with suspicion toward every client who walked through her door, but with a renewed commitment to taking seriously the things that could not always be explained cleanly, the small, cumulative signals that pointed toward something worth examining more closely. long before they hardened into undeniable proof. He closed the laptop that night feeling something he had not expected to feel this clearly. Not certainty about the future, which he understood now would never fully arrive no matter how much work he did, but a steady, grounded peace with the uncertainty itself, a willingness to keep choosing, one day at a time, without needing a guarantee he had finally learned no one could ever truly give. 18 months after Sophia Marin sat down across from Daniel Whitfield for the first time, unaware that a distant memory from a dinner party would soon unravel a pattern neither of them had fully understood, the two of them stood together on the rooftop terrace of the restored theater Sophia had spent nearly 2 years bringing back to life. The building had reopened the previous month, its original architectural details preserved carefully, alongside the structural repairs that had once required Sophia to spend long hours examining hidden cracks and quietly failing supports, work that had taught her, long before she ever met Daniel, how to recognize damage that did not announce itself loudly. Elena and Nadia had been invited to the small celebration Sophia hosted that evening, along with a handful of colleagues and friends, and Elena found herself standing near the edge of the terrace with a glass of wine, watching Daniel and Sophia across the room, easy and comfortable with each other, in a way that had taken nearly 2 full years of careful, honest work to build. "You did good work with that one," Nadia said, joining her at the railing, nodding subtly toward Daniel. "I did not do the work," Elena said. "He did. Dr. Ose did. Sophia did. More than either of them probably realizes, by refusing to look away from something uncomfortable, and refusing, just as firmly, to pretend it was simple. All I did was notice a pattern I almost talked myself out of trusting." Nadia smiled, remembering the early weeks of quiet uncertainty, the private notebook, the small, accumulating signals that had seemed, individually, too vague to act on. "That noticing mattered more than you are giving yourself credit for," she said. 22 women walked through those interviews before anyone said anything clearly enough to matter. If you had kept dismissing it as pickiness, there might have been 40, 50. There is no telling how long the pattern would have continued, or how much harm it would have caused, if someone had not finally decided that instinct, even without hard proof, was worth taking seriously. Elena considered this quietly, watching Daniel say something that made Sophia laugh, an easy, unguarded sound that seemed to carry none of the careful watchfulness that had characterized their early meetings. "I think about that often," she admitted, "how close we came to letting it continue, how ordinary it felt, in the moment, to keep dismissing 11 separate small warnings simply because none of them, on their own, seemed like enough." Across the terrace, Daniel excused himself briefly and made his way toward Elena, greeting her warmly, a gratitude in his expression that had grown steadier and less desperate over the many months since their first difficult conversation. "Not just for what you did back then, though that mattered more than I think I ever fully expressed, but for everything since. The way you have kept holding me accountable, even after things started going well, even when it would have been easier to just let the story become a simple happy ending." Elena smiled, though her expression carried a seriousness that matched his own. "That is the part people forget," she said. "The happy parts of a story like this are real and worth celebrating, but they do not erase what came before them, or excuse anyone involved from continuing to pay attention, carefully, for as long as it takes. I am glad you understand that. It is rarer than you might think." Daniel nodded, glancing back toward Sophia, who was deep in conversation with one of her colleagues about the theater's restored ceiling murals, her hands moving animatedly as she described some structural detail Elena could not quite follow from across the room. "I still write to Dr. Ose's questions every week," he said. "Even the ones that feel repetitive now, especially those, actually. I think that is part of what she meant, early on, when she told me healing is not a single event you complete and then move past. It is a practice you keep choosing, the same way choosing to stay with someone freely is a practice, not a decision you make once and never revisit." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Sophia found Daniel standing alone near the terrace railing, looking out over the city lights, and she came to stand beside him quietly, neither of them speaking for a long moment. "Do you remember what I told you during our second interview?" she asked eventually, "about cracks in a foundation and reinforcing them without ever addressing what caused them?" "I remember," Daniel said. "I think about it often, actually. More than almost anything else you have ever said to me. I think about it too, Sophia said. Because I look at you now, and I do not see someone who reinforced the crack and hid it better. I see someone who actually went back and rebuilt the foundation itself. Slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. That is rare. Most people never do that work. They just get better at hiding the crack from the people close enough to notice it. Daniel turned to look at her, something steady and unguarded in his expression that would have been unimaginable in the composed, controlled man who once reduced 23 women to rows in a spreadsheet, searching for someone who would guarantee she would never leave. I could not have done it without the crack being found first, he said. Without you asking a question I had spent 3 years avoiding, and without Elena and Nadia caring enough about strangers to make sure someone finally asked it. Sophia smiled, leaning against the railing beside him, the lights of the restored theater glowing warmly behind them, evidence of another kind of careful, patient restoration, one that had also required looking honestly beneath the surface before anything new could safely be built on top. Somewhere across the city that same evening, Charlotte Vane sat in her own apartment, reading, for the second time, a brief update Elena had sent her some weeks earlier, careful and respectful of the boundaries Charlotte had set, informing her only that the man who had once made her feel like she was disappearing had spent the past 18 months doing real, documented work to understand and change the pattern that had caused her so much quiet harm. Charlotte did not respond to the message, and she did not need to. She simply sat with it for a while, feeling something she had not expected to feel. Not forgiveness exactly, and not quite closure either, but something adjacent to both. A quiet confirmation that the truth she had spoken on her way out the door 4 years earlier had, eventually, after all this time, actually been heard. Elena stayed until nearly everyone had gone, helping Sophia's staff clear away the last of the glasses and folding chairs, and before she left, she found herself standing once more at the railing, looking out over the same view that had held Daniel and Sophia's quiet conversation only a short while earlier. Nadia joined her there, the two of them silent for a moment, tired in the satisfied way that follows a long, meaningful day. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Sophia had not remembered that dinner party? Nadia asked eventually. If Candidate 23 had simply been another ordinary interview, no different from the 22 before it. Elena considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things now, having learned over the past 2 years that easy answers were rarely the honest ones. I think about it sometimes, she admitted, but I try not to dwell on it too long, because it leads somewhere unproductive, imagining an alternate version of events we were lucky enough to avoid. What I try to focus on instead is what we do now, with what we learned. Sophia's memory was not luck exactly, though there was certainly luck involved in the timing of it. But even without her, the 11 other reports were already accumulating in that notebook. I would like to believe we would have eventually connected them ourselves, even without her particular piece of the puzzle. I do not know that for certain, but I have to believe attention like that is not the only path to the truth, even if it is often the fastest one. Nadia nodded, understanding the careful hope embedded in Elena's answer, neither naive nor cynical, but grounded in the hard-won lessons of the past 2 years. It is strange work we do, she said. Most days it looks like simple introductions, dinner reservations, follow-up calls about whether 2 people enjoyed each other's company, and then, every so often, it becomes something much larger and much more serious than either of us signed up for when we started. I think that is true of most work that actually matters, Elena said. It looks ordinary right up until the moment it is not, and the only way to be ready for that moment is to take the ordinary parts seriously enough that you notice when something underneath them has quietly shifted. They left the terrace together not long after, the theater's restored lights glowing warmly behind them as they made their way down to the street, the city continuing its ordinary evening rhythm around them, entirely unaware of the quiet, difficult, ultimately hopeful story that had unfolded across its neighborhoods over the past 2 years. A story that had begun with a rigid spreadsheet and 22 rejected women, and had ended, not with a perfect resolution, but with something more honest and more valuable than that. A handful of people who had chosen, again and again, to look closely at an uncomfortable truth, rather than looking away from it. In the months that followed, Elena's agency continued its careful work, matching new clients, refining its intake process further as new lessons emerged. occasionally catching a pattern, early enough that the person involved never fully understood how close they had come to causing real harm, before someone noticed and gently intervened. Priya Nandan became an informal advisor to the agency, helping train Nadia and the small team of associates Elena, eventually hired as the business grew, on how to recognize the subtle, hard-to-articulate signals that had once taken 11 separate reports to finally add up to something undeniable. Grace Bellamy, Natalie Pierce, and Claire Wynn, each, in their own time and their own way, found relationships that felt nothing like their brief, unsettling interviews with Daniel had felt. Relationships built on genuine curiosity, rather than quiet evaluation. And though none of them ever spoke publicly about what had happened, each one carried forward a slightly sharper instinct for recognizing the difference between healthy attention and something more controlling, dressed up as care. Charlotte Vane, in her own time, began dating again, carefully and slowly, carrying with her the hard-won understanding that harm did not need to be dramatic or visible to be real, and that trusting her own instincts, even when she could not fully explain them, was not something she needed anyone else's permission to do. And Daniel Whitfield continued the work he had begun that difficult morning in Elena's small office, not because the work ever fully finished, but because he had come, slowly and with considerable effort, to understand that this was simply what love actually required, not a guarantee extracted through vigilance and control, but a daily, ongoing choice, made freely, again and again, by two people who remained, always, entirely capable of walking away, and who chose, instead, each single day, to stay. The story of the 23rd interview never became the dramatic public spectacle a lesser account might have made of it. There was no scandal, no public reckoning, no headline naming names. What there was, instead, was something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. A group of people who noticed something wrong, who refused to look away from it despite the discomfort and professional risk involved, and who worked, patiently and honestly, to turn a pattern of quiet harm into a foundation for something genuinely better. Not just for the two people at the center of the story, but for everyone who came after them, protected now by lessons learned the hard way, so that the next difficult pattern might be caught not after 22 interviews, but after 2, or perhaps, if the world continued to grow a little wiser with each hard lesson learned, not at all.